There we are. Okay, dear students, welcome back. Here we are at the course on environmental bioethics in the Masters in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your divine love through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, before going forward, any questions or comments from previous lectures? All right. I sent out an email asking for your hours up to now on the internship. Okay, some have responded already. The others, please look at that email and give me just a rough estimate of how many hours you've done so far and where. Remember that it can be more than one place. And remember that I'm still offering 3 for 1 here at St. Thomas, working in the forest. Okay, going forward then, we have been looking at, in this environmental bioethics course, we have been looking at the formation of the earth with all its layers. And if you think about it, the first 3 lectures were essentially the first 4 lectures were the abiotic factors that allow for the possibility of life on Earth. And then we started looking at energy last lecture, which again, there is a flow of energy, second law of thermodynamics, that nothing is created or destroyed after the Big Bang, but everything is transformed. And we speak in terms of energy transformation. The big source of energy into the Earth is from where? From the sun, light energy, right? Solar energy, mostly light. Also other kinds of radiation, but mostly photons, which are then transformed for the purpose of nature. The big transformer is amazing that it comes down to a single biochemical reaction. Just one biochemical reaction is the one that allows for the transformation of energy into something that is useful for maintaining life. And what is that chemical reaction? Involves light, so it's a photosynthesis. Imagine all the thousands, maybe millions of chemical reactions that exist on Earth, all right? And that it comes down to one single chemical reaction that is so elegant, we say, that is able to capture light energy into potential energy, which is chemical energy in the covalent bond of the carbon-carbon skeleton. And that potential energy is just stored there in the good old glucose molecule, the carbohydrates, until those carbohydrates are then burned, right, to release the energy. And that's the converse, the complementary chemical reaction. It's the same reaction but going in the opposite direction, right? The end products of one become the starting materials of the other reaction. And in life, what is that burning reaction called? Respiration. Respiration, cellular respiration, right? Which involves the oxygen that is a byproduct of the photosynthesis and so forth. So with cellular respiration, we are actually doing controlled burning, very, very controlled burning down to the cellular level. And in that controlled burning, the energy that's released is used for recharging the ATPs that run all the metabolism of every organism. So obviously these two complementary reactions were established in nature very early on, at the very beginning, at the onset of life, right? At the onset of life, where we had that protocell. So they're complementary, and that is what allows for life on Earth, organically speaking. So we looked at the picture of energy and energy flow and energy for humans, because we also need sources of energy to live in a civilized way and to move around and to do all the extra stuff that other animals don't do, including manufacturing artifacts that no other animal does. And that takes a lot of energy. One challenge of all this energy production and consumption in the world by the one species, the human species, is the byproduct of the CO2, which is an increase, as we saw in that budget, that net 4 gigatons of CO2 that humans have been pumping into the atmosphere over the decades. It's accumulating and increasing the temperature gradually. So we're building up a case here toward looking at climate change and global warming and a number of consequences of that. And that will be next lecture, all right? Which will be the culminating lecture. Today, we're going to be looking at succession and human population growth in general, and then human population growth. Because again, we have taken off on the growth curve. We're in the log phase of the growth curve, meaning that the population is increasing very, very fast right now in a logarithmic way. And of course, with more people, then more energy production and consumption, and more of the CO2 and the other waste that we saw that is being produced, right, impacting the environment. So we are right now at a critical stage, interesting, challenging, that we are living at this critical stage of humanity for the planet, right? And therefore, an extra effort to ask the Holy Spirit to inspire us for creative ways of being able to live sustainably. That's the key word today, sustainable, moving forward into the future. Okay, so 2 main topics of today, what is known as succession and then population growth, applied first to nature in general and then to the human nature, okay? So going forward then, on succession, we had essentially 3 stages. This is looking at it in a very simplified way. Of course, when we get into nature itself, we see that the picture is more complex, right? But looking at it in a simple way, a simplistic model of succession, we have 3 stages: the pioneer stage, the intermediate species, and then finally the dominant species on a stable environment that is called a climax community. Then in the second half of the lecture, we'll look at population growth with a curve, what is known as the carrying capacity of each species, the carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals that can live in a particular region, and then human population growth and development goals set by the UN moving forward. So back to succession then in nature. These are the 3 main stages that I mentioned. The pioneer stages, the pioneer species are plants that come into an area that is originally barren. It can be soil, it can be sand, it can be rock, all right? But any surface on the geosphere that doesn't have any visible plant material yet. Typically, there will be microbes there and fungi and other microorganisms, bacteria for sure, but at least no plant material yet, so no photosynthesis is going on. That will be a barren area. And it will be colonized by what is known as pioneer species. And these pioneer species tend to be pretty hardy. They are mosses, lichens. Lichens are very interesting because lichens are a combination of fungi and algae. It's what is known as a symbiotic relationship. So let's look a little bit at fungi here, at lichens. And they're typically on the green-gray side, green-gray, all right? Some have little tufts on them. But basically, these are lichens. Some are on the yellowish side. And what we have is essentially a fungus of some sort, which is more or less transparent. And that fungus gets colonized by algae. And the algae will be of a different green color, sometimes brownish, sometimes grayish, all right? But that color is telling us that there are chloroplasts and that therefore there's photosynthesis going on the algae side. The fungus, of course, is not a plant, is not an animal either. It's a saprophyte, in other words, it's a decomposer. But the fungus benefits from the algae. It gets the glucose, the carbohydrates that the algae is producing. The algae gets the benefit of a liquid environment because fungi are very hydrated. Typically, you know, they grow in wet environments, humid. And so they have a lot of humidity in them, maybe 90%, 95% humidity. Inside, internal, so they maintain a liquid environment and the algae can live in there because algae need to live in water. And what happens is that this combination, which I say is a symbiotic relationship where both species benefit, all right? The net result of this is that the fungi also secrete substances that are acidic and break down minerals. So they erode rocks and they erode soil and sand and so forth, mostly rocks where the lichens grow, okay? And so it's a process that allows for soil formation. So those are lichens. Mosses are very small plants. That also like a wet environment, okay? Because the gametes have to swim to fertilize. And they also tend to colonize an area that would be originally barren, mostly wet logs and very wet environment. So these are pioneer species. And the net result of these species is that not only are they breaking down the organic material and also the rock material where they're growing, at the same time, when they die at an individual level, they leave behind organic material that is also broken down by bacteria and other fungi. So they contribute to soil formation, little by little, soil formation, nutrients. So eventually, other intermediate species will come in. And the intermediate species will be grasses, shrubs, bushes, herbs, weeds, right? These are intermediate species. They tend to be a little larger in size, broader in variety of species. And little by little, the area that used to be barren, it's being colonized. It's being colonized by plant material. And then, of course, with plants will come also animals, beginning with herbivores that will eat the plants. typically insects and other types of animals that will move into the area because now they have a food source, okay? And as these plant materials are dying and decomposing, they form more nutrients, they form more soil that is more rich. And so that attracts larger plants. Eventually, after several successions that happen, typically with an increase in quality and quantity of plants, in other words, more plants coming into the area, more variety of plants, larger plants, and so forth, they continue to deposit more organic material until eventually trees move in, right? And now the trees will be more established. They stabilize the environment even better, providing for a habitat for an ecosystem for other animals to move into the area, a greater variety, and even to transition from one area to another, okay? So once we get to the tree stage, eventually these trees will compete with each other until one or two or three species will establish and become what is known as the dominant species of trees. And typically the dominant species is the largest tree, the longest living, and they will provide mostly the canopy, which is the top layer of the forest. Any forest or any established ecosystem will have essentially three layers structurally, three layers. The top part, which is known as the canopy, right? And the largest trees are reaching and are making the canopy. Then the ground cover, which is mostly herbs, bushes, grasses, palms, depending on the geographical region. That's the ground cover. They don't get to grow too tall, typically no taller than the height of a person, if even that. And then in between the ground cover and the canopy is a middle layer. That middle layer is called the understory. Understory, a single word. It's under the canopy, and it's like one story under the canopy, all right? So understory. And there you have the intermediate trees and bushes. That area there can be pretty dense. And that area also is the one that typically becomes invaded with invasive species when there is disturbance of an area, okay? And that's the case that we have here at St. Thomas University with a slash pine forest. Here, this is slash pine. We have a slash pine forest that is the dominant species is the slash pine. And so we call that a climax community, meaning that that type of ecosystem will not change. The individuals change, but the species remain pretty stable as long as the climate remains more or less stable. If the climate changes significantly toward colder, wetter, drier, hotter, etc., if the climate changes significantly, then it will revert back into another state, to new stages of succession, depending on how hardy the dominant species is. If the dominant species survives the climate change, then the ecosystem stays as it is. But if the climate change is so drastic that the dominant species is not able to survive, that dominant species will then be replaced by another species of tree that is more adapted to the new climate. Follow? And so there will be a new stage of succession occurring, and eventually a new species will establish. So going back to the issue of disturbance, disturbance is when we have invasive species coming into a new geographical area where they've never been before. And typically that's by human introduction because the continents don't mix, right? How do we get Australian pines in South Florida? because we're nowhere near Australia. It's on the other side of the earth. And these pines don't swim, okay? Which, by the way, they are from Australia, but they're not true pines. It's called convergent evolution or parallel evolution, but they're not real pines. They just look like needles, but actually those are twigs. At any rate, they were introduced by humans, and typically they're introduced either as ornamental plants for decoration or as agricultural plants. For example, some grasses that were brought from Africa for feeding cattle and got out into the environment, and they grow wild very fast. The challenge with invasive species is that they don't have any native enemies or native insects or animals that eat them, right? And therefore, they tend to grow faster than the native population, and they will replace the native population. And that is true for plants and animals. So South Florida, being a subtropical environment and the only subtropical region in continental United States, we're very sensitive to invasive species that have come from other parts of the world, all other continents, from South American continent, from the African continent, from Asia, and from Australia, and from India. For example, the figs, straggling figs, they come from India, also known as the banyan tree, right? Very aggressive. So all these are invasive species that have come in over the decades that have been introduced by humans over the decades. Of course, back then, 50 years ago, all of this was not really known well, and people did not do it with evil intent. But the fact is that that's why I say ignorance is the enemy, because many of these species that were introduced are now going wild into the Everglades and other natural environments, okay? All right, so here's a synopsis then. We start with small pioneer plants that get replaced over a period of time by a series of successions into intermediate species, and eventually the trees come in and mature trees settle in to form a climax community, Climax Forest, and which will typically have one or two dominant species of trees. In our case, once again, it is the slash pine, Dade County slash pine. So we talk about it a little bit, and just to recap, here is a satellite image of the campus. We have about 140 acres of land. Here's the 37th Street entrance. And it winds around, as you know, to the left, coming in toward the chapel, which is here. This is our slash pine forest, which is about 15 to 20 acres. The actual forest is in this area. Then it has other slash pine trees, as you can see here, the canopy from above. But the side areas, both east and west, are what we call manicured because there's lawn underneath, there's grass. So the lawnmower goes through there. Just yesterday, the lawnmower was going through the grassy area here. So that area is already manicured. It's not a real forest. This, for example, is a science building here. You can see that the satellite images are not up to date because now, instead of this parking lot, we have the new building of business here, the business building, which is diagonal, and it's looking in toward the forest, right? So we'll be doing a lot of clearing of the forest of invasive species over the months and years, making progress there little by little, but it's a lot of hard work. Nature does have a natural lawnmower, if you will, to take care of the understory with wildfires. But because this is an urban forest and it's surrounded by urbanicity, then we cannot afford to have a wildfire in here. Therefore, we have to do by hand what nature would do with a fire. It's labor intensive, but it's very rewarding because then once we clear the forest, we are restoring it to its original ecosystem, and that is essentially forest management, forest restoration. So we have a restoration project going here. It's long-term, and it's trying to preserve the 10% more or less of the property that is still in a pristine or in a original state of the slash pine. As far as we know, this is the last remaining highland sandy slash pine forest left in Dade County, in Miami-Dade County, right? I say sandy highland because there is also slash pine in the southern part of the county. If you're familiar with Dade County, down by Perrine and near Homestead, it's called rockland pine. And it's the same species, Pinus elioti, but that one grows on top of the limestone, and therefore they don't get as thick and majestic as they get here because this is sandy soil, and down there is rocky limestone, so the root system cannot really penetrate very deeply, and they become thin and tall and spindly. But these thicken out because the root system is unencumbered with all that sand down there, and they really grow very large to the point that most of the trees that we have, the slash pine trees that we have here on campus, are called specimen trees. Specimens is a category of the largest trees that have over 1.5 feet of diameter of the trunk, that the trunk will be 1.5 feet or 4.5 feet in circumference, okay? So that most, I can tell you, most of the pine trees that we have here at St. Thomas, one person cannot go around the trunk. It takes at least 2 people to go around the trunk, and some of them even 3 people to go around a single trunk. So they're just huge, majestic trees, and we're trying to preserve them. All right. Let's look at population growth. This is the typical population growth curve, which is known as a sigmoid growth curve. Sigmoid. It has 3 stages to it, basically. It has an initial stage, an intermediate stage, and a final stage, right? And this is on the, of course, on the x-axis, the independent variable is time. The y-axis is the number of individuals of whatever species, As far as we know, every species that we have studied on Earth so far follows generally a sigmoid growth curve, all right? Which is like an S stretched out a little bit, S shape, and that's why it's called sigmoid. Sigma in Greek, the S letter. So the initial phase is known as a lag phase, L-A-G, lag, because it lags, it's slowly growing up, right? Keep in mind that generally under ideal conditions, there is a duplication of the population in every generation, all right? So the simplest example is with bacteria or even just mitosis. One mother cell splits into 2 daughter cells, and each one of those 2 daughter cells, when they mature, they split into 2 more daughter cells. So it's a geometric progression. And you can see starting with 1, the next generation will be 2, and the next one 4, and then 8 and 16 and 32 and 64 and 128, and it keeps doubling at every generation. So initially, it starts out slowly, right? Also because in nature, not every individual gets to mate or reproduce, right? And also of the individuals that get to reproduce, not every offspring gets to survive either. So there is also death occurring in any population. There is dearth occurring along the way. As soon as there is life, there is also death occurring, all right? So this is a net flow. At any rate, originally, the population starts slowly, That's why it's called lag, L-A-G. But then with time, because there are more individuals that are reproducing within that particular population, then it goes into a log phase, log or exponential phase, doubling the population essentially with every new generation, right? And so it starts growing very, very fast. The numbers will duplicate with every generation. And therefore it goes into the fastest growth rate is precisely the log or exponential phase. But then what happens? This obviously is adding new individuals into the environment, into that particular ecosystem. And these individuals are obviously consuming resources, a larger amount of the resources for staying alive. And therefore the resources begin to diminish, right? And as the resources begin to exhaust, then the population will start leveling off until it reaches what is known as a stationary phase, which is the number of individuals that are being born is approximately equivalent to the number of individuals that are dying. Because at that stage, the resources are being maxed out. Whatever resources are available in that particular geographical region, right? Because we're talking about a population, remember, it's a single species, many individuals or several individuals of a single species in a particular geographical region, local region. So because we don't have unlimited resources, because the resources are always limited, that will limit the maximum number of individuals that can live in that particular region. Okay. And that's called the stationary phase. And then it will level off and continue that way, in principle, indefinitely until the environmental conditions change. But if the environmental conditions don't change, then it will stabilize, and that would be equivalent to a climax community. Now, that leveling there is a specific number of individuals, okay? And that is known as the carrying capacity of this particular environment. And different ecosystems will have different carrying capacity for different species at any particular time. But it's stable basically. As long as the climate doesn't change significantly, then it will stabilize, and every species has a carrying capacity, okay? Except for one species that we really don't know what is the carrying capacity for the one species, because it happens that this one species has a single population throughout the whole world. And that species is the human. Biologically speaking, looking at the human species, I mentioned that the human species is considered a single population throughout the whole world because in principle, any individual, any two individuals from the world, any fertile male and any fertile female, fertile man or fertile woman, in principle are able to mate and produce fertile offsprings anywhere in the world, okay? Independent of ethnicity, race, or any other factor. As long as they're biologically fertile, in principle, they can mate and produce fertile offspring, which is the definition of a species throughout the whole world. And therefore, we are really considered a single population, even though we are many, many different cultures throughout the world, all right? So for every other species, the carrying capacity is studied and known and determined, except for the human, because of the unique properties of the human population, which we'll look at in the second half of the lecture. Okay, so again, some concepts here. The growth curve is known as a sigmoid or S-shaped growth curve. Sigmoid comes from sigma in Greek, which is the letter S. You can see it's kind of stretched out. And it has three stages: the lag phase, the log phase, and the stationary phase. At the stationary phase is when it gives us the carrying capacity of that population, which is specifically number of individuals in this geographical region for each particular species, whether it's a plant, an animal, a fungus, a bacteria. All right, some examples. Here's an example of grass. In fact, there are several different grasses in this example. As you can see, there's some grass here. This is different type of grass in the background. Some other wheat here with little yellow flowers. Each one of these is kind of competing for resources, all right? But they will reach a stable community among all the different grasses and herbs that are growing in this area, in this particular lot. And so each one of these grasses and herbs will have a carrying capacity. In other words, the maximum number of individuals of each one of these plant species that this lot here can maintain. And as long as the climate doesn't change significantly, then that number of individuals will stay stable, because as new individuals are being germinated, sprouting, other older individuals are dying off, okay, and are being replaced. So there's a replacement level. This is fairly dense in general. Plants tend to crowd this way. It's a natural behavior. It can happen also in animal husbandry, for example, with cattle. The maximum number of cattle that a plot of land can sustain, it's not unlimited, all right? It's not unlimited. There's a limited number of cattle that a plot of grass can maintain. In the wild, some top carnivores, for example, this pair of pumas here, which can be cougars, mountain lions, or panthers, more or less the same feline. They are top carnivores. These top carnivores need a huge area, square miles of range, because they're hunters, okay? And so they need a fairly large territory for hunting. And maybe in this several square miles, this is the only pair of cougars that there is. And the carrying capacity of this environment is 2 for the cougar, all right, until they have cubs. And eventually the cubs will have 1, 2, or 3 cubs. And on average, how many cubs are going to survive? 2, who will replace the parents eventually, all right? So sometimes the numbers are very small. At the other, that happens with top carnivores, and it happens on land, and it happens in the ocean also. At the other end of the scale will be typically the smallest organisms on Earth, which are going to be bacteria. And these are bacteria growing on the tip of a pin. So this is a pin, and this is the tip of a pin. This is obviously a micrograph, a microscopic photograph that has been colorized. So you see these are rod-shaped bacteria. These are bacilli, right? And they're growing. There's still a little bit of room for more bacteria to grow. Eventually, when the whole surface of the tip of the pin is covered with bacteria, then that's the carrying capacity for that bacillus on that pin tip, all right? So you can see it's all according to the individual species that we're talking about. Okay, now we make the transition to the human. Here's the population growth curve of the human, going back maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, more or less, which is what is thought to be about 7,000 years ago, or 7,000 BC actually, which is makes it about 9,000 years, right? Is the beginning of civilization, or rather, I'm talking about agriculture. Agriculture, sedentary is the word I was looking for. So we know from the fossil record and from material culture and cultural anthropology that primitive humans, remember the first course we had when we looked at the phylogenetics of the human species, primitive humans were mostly nomadic. They were hunter-gatherers. They would follow animals and hunt them down and eat mostly plant material. And they were nomads moving from one place to another constantly. And so in that nomadic stage, it was very difficult to establish any kind of culture, all right, because they had to be on the move all the time. And so it was counterproductive to build too many things and to carry those tools around. So typically they would only make a few tools easy enough to carry around. And if they started getting too heavy or too many, they would just leave them and keep moving because they had to survive. And then enters into humanity agriculture. In other words, the possibility of farming, right? Primitive farming, primary agriculture, which is basically depending on rainwater and gathering the fruit that was being produced by grains. It is thought that this primitive agriculture started in the Middle East, in what is known as the Fertile Crescent. A little review again from the first course on fundamentals in bioethics, which is also known as what used to be Mesopotamia, Babylon, what is today Iraq and Iran, Persian Gulf. Let's see, I'm trying to look for, let's try doing this. Go into Google Earth, satellite. Why not? We have the advantage of free satellite imaging. Okay, so we have just taken a virtual trip to Eurasia. And now we're going to zoom in to the Fertile Crescent, which nowadays is looking kind of barren. It's this area here, Iran, Iraq. But there are two main rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which back in time, now they're all channeled and so forth. It looks pretty dry. But back in time, this area was very fertile. And that is thought to be the birthplace of agricultural civilization. Let's see. Just want to reproduce this map for a moment. Where is new? New. So that we can well, overlay. There it is. Okay, where's the map? Where's the map? advertisement. All right, more or less. You follow? Here's Egypt, the Nile, the delta of the Nile, which is still green, thanks be to God, because of all the water, soil, silt, the deposits there. Then the Arabic Peninsula here, okay? Arabic Peninsula, desert. And then we have the Tigris and the Euphrates flowing here. Here's the Tigris, sorry, Euphrates at the bottom, the Tigris on the top. Like I say, they're all channeled today, so they're hard to see. Basically, this one is the Euphrates, goes right through Syria, Iraq, Iran, that area. And this was the Fertile Crescent. So yeah, back that. As dry as it looks today, this is considered to be the birthplace of agricultural civilization, where humans began to harvest some grains that were showing by evolution, all right, a little more grain that was coming out of some grasses. You know, that wheat, for example, all the grains are grasses, okay? And so they started favoring the grains that were a little larger and planting those. And then as the new plants came up, they would take the larger grains from the plants that had those grains and planted those, and they kept enhancing it, doing what is known as artificial selection. They were selecting on the larger grains because they can get some nourishment from the grains. And that's how agriculture started, according to the anthropologists, in this region about 7,000 BC. Okay? So that's why this scale starts around there. And what that allowed was for humans to settle down and not have to be chasing the animals all the time, or just going after seasonal fruit or berries, etc. And therefore, we had started having a better growth rate and a little bit more healthy. There was a little less danger in living, so people survived a little longer, and population started increasing, but very, very slowly. So you can see that this is our lag phase that went on for thousands of years, essentially for about 7,000 years, maybe 8,000 years. Until we get into the Middle Ages, in Europe and other parts of the world, but mostly Europe, but a few other civilizations also. And in the Middle Ages, there begins to be a little bit more hygiene, all right? And therefore, less death rate. The death rate, so people are able to live a little longer. And the population goes into the synergy of the log phase. And this is only in the past 500 years or so that it has shot up, skyrocketing. It's almost vertical in the log phase, mostly due to hygiene, so that the mortality rate was lowered. People live longer, and women didn't die necessarily with the last birthing, okay? And therefore, we go into a log phase. Just in the past 500 years, more or less. To about 8 billion. This one actually is a little, so it's a projection to 2025, but we're just under 8 billion people, right? Just under, right around 8 billion people in the world today. So we're definitely into this log phase, and it seemed as if there was no end to the log phase, all right? But you notice that there's a slight curvature here. The hint, because it's projected out a few more years, the hint of a stabilizing, of becoming stationary, again, it's going to have to do with resources, right? Because we don't have unlimited resources. So we're going to be looking at this phenomenon here. First, just to start with the first two phases of our sigmoid curve. And like I say, we don't really know the carrying capacity of the human, because how do we test for that? We can only test for it indirectly, and it's a projection into the future, okay? Because we have this single population that is still growing, and technically we're still in the log phase. Even though recently there has been reports of slowing down, especially in the more industrialized nations. I'll talk about that a little bit down the lecture. Okay, so this is just to present the population growth curve for the human, and I want to tackle this question of are we overpopulating the earth, okay? Is the human population now going into overpopulation with all of the consequences that that has, positive and negative? And typically what we hear about overpopulation, typically that is more negative than positive, right? The net is negative because of the contamination and many, many other factors that come into play. So that's a question, that's a big question we're going to tackle. To do that, we need to look a little bit at geography also, to look at where the population is, where these 8 billion people are. Okay? So here's the distribution of the human population by density. As you can see, the darker the color, moving from orange through red, dark red into violet, is higher density. So overall, in the big picture, we see 3, 4, or 5 regions. Asia, Southeast Asia, is the highest populated area. Mostly, this is mostly China. This is mostly India, the two most populated countries of the world by density, which is number of individuals per square surface, right? Per surface, per area. Number of individuals per area gives us the population density. On the human is number of people per square miles or square kilometers, if we're going to use metrics. So we have Southeast in China, including also Korea, the Korea Peninsula, and Japan. And then we have India. Third region is Europe, continental Europe, all right? And also the Middle East here. This is Turkey, for example. Okay. Then we have a pocket in Central Africa. Then we have a few pockets on the coast of South America, the East Coast and the West Coast, South America. Then there is Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica includes Central America and Mexico. Then finally, there is the US, the eastern half of the US, more, you can see much more than the western part of the US. The Midwest is pretty open. But then there are vast areas of land, right, shown in green, where there's basically no population, or gray. So green is 2 to 10 people per square kilometer, all right? That's the green, very, very low density, the lowest density population. And the gray, essentially no people living in a stable basis. For example, beginning down here with Australia, which is a continent. The central part of Australia is one huge desert. Essentially no people live there on a stable basis. Then there's Siberia. Okay, remember this is all Russia here. Russia, I think, covers about 12 time zones, 12 of the 24 time zones. So there's that huge region of Siberia. And then central China, including the Mongolia, which is here, right? Desert. There is the Sahara in Northern Africa. South America, it's interesting, it's a contrast because Sahara is one of the driest places on Earth, just like Central Australia. But then one of the wettest places on Earth is the Amazon basin. But again, because it's so wet and it's mostly underwater, rainwater, fresh water that is flowing through, then there's very little population density. And in some areas of the Amazon, no stable population, okay? Maybe some nomadic tribes coming, moving through, transitioning. Central Midwest, some pockets there, but then mostly Canada. Most of Canada. It's interesting to see photographs of Canada at night, because you can see the border. Let me see. Image Canada at night. You can see where the border is because of all the little lights. Okay. This is the US. Obviously, it shows at night the density, right? Population density by the lights. And then you can see here's the border with Canada. And then it's just dark on the northern part of Canada. Look at that. It's dark, and this is all continent here. It's huge, right? But it's dark because very, very sparsely populated. Too cold. All right. So the bottom line of all this is that only about half, globally, only about half of the land mass on Earth is actually populated or is actually habitable, right? I forgot to mention, for example, here is Greenland, okay? And there is also Antarctica down here, which is not even shown, another continent, not habitable on a stable basis, unless there are a few scientists there, hardy scientists that are surviving under extreme conditions. But globally, we can say that only about half of the landmass of the world is habitable. Okay? And it's mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, as you can see, this big chunk here, and a little bit in the Southern Hemisphere. So when we do the numbers of that, it comes to the current population density of the world, taking the 8 billion people and dividing it by the total landmass of the Earth, it comes to about 52 people per kilometer square, okay? But that's it theoretic. Now, I had also sent the, let me see here. Yes, the spreadsheet where I did this calculation, just to look at it briefly, since you're coming off the statistics course, which I hope went well for everyone. Didn't hear any complaints, so Here we have the population of the world, approximately, okay, rounded off to the nearest 100 million. And the land area of the world, about 150 million kilometers. When we do the math on that, divide these two, we get a density of 52 people per square kilometer, all right? 52 persons per square kilometer. Now, that's the theoretic. However, when you keep in mind, that's why I brought up the spreadsheet, because this is the total land mass. But we said that of the total land mass, only about 50% is habitable, right? Only about 50% is habitable. Therefore, the population density is actually double that, okay? And that's why I put there theoretical. Where is it? Yes, this is the theoretic population, because this is taking the total landmass of the surface of the Earth. The actual population is double this, right? The population density is double this, because half of the landmass of the Earth is not habitable. When we project that to St. Thomas University, just to get a feel, because most of us are familiar with the campus, right? Here, what I've done with these bars in color is that each bar is 100 meters. Here's a scale, again, from the map of Google Earth. You see the scale here on the bottom right is 100 meters. So I generated a little bar and then just reproduce that bar in different colors so we can see it. The bottom line is that our campus is more or less square. It is 700 meters deep, if you will, going north-south, and about 800 meters wide, okay? So when we multiply these numbers just to get the surface, it's about, so that makes it about half a kilometer square, sorry. So it's about half a kilometer square, our campus. And then what I did here is I projected the equivalent of 52 people per square kilometer, right? But because we have half a kilometer, then I took only half of that. Well, it's a little, it's 29 people total would be the density, the theoretical density, right? And this is how it would look if people were homogeneously spread on campus. This would be representative of the population density of the world on our campus. It would be 29 people in the half kilometer that we have. All right, 29 people, so the little red figures are 29, hopefully, and I spread them out more or less homogeneously. Now, what is wrong with this picture? It's not in the quantity, but it's in the quality. In other words, the numbers are correct, 29 for our surface area, but what is wrong is that the human population density is not homogeneously spread throughout the world, as this map indicates. There are pockets of high density, right? There are pockets of high density and pockets of low density. So it is not a homogeneous distribution as I have it spread out here. Okay. Whoop, sorry. It's not a homogeneous distribution. It's rather clustered. And this is typical of any living organism, any species on Earth. We tend to cluster, whether it's plants, animals, bacteria, fungi. The standard pattern in nature is to cluster, not to have a homogeneous distribution, okay, at the local level. So when we go back to this map, because only 50% is habitable, then we have to double the density. That's why I said that the theoretic density was 52 persons per square kilometer, but the realistic density, the actual density, I should put actual density, is about 104 persons per square kilometer of the available surface, of the habitable surface of the Earth. That means then that we need to double the number of little red people on our campus. So instead of being the 52, it's 104. To our campus would be 59. Okay, and so here is the 59 people on our campus. You can see it's a much higher density, right? Again, because half of the world is not inhabitable, half of the landmass. But this is still a homogeneous distribution, which is not realistic. In fact, even on campus, it's interesting, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. On campus, we don't walk around like this in a homogeneous distribution. Our classrooms aren't even in a homogeneous distribution. It's mostly on this corner here, the southeast corner of the property, okay? The east and the south is where we have our buildings, and that was done on purpose, precisely. All the buildings were built in this area to stay away from the forest and to try to preserve the forest. Now what's happening is that there's more construction going on, like I mentioned. The business building is here already, which is in the right up to the forest area. The other new building, which is that student center and dorms, cafeteria, whatever, is going here. You know, so we're pushing closer toward the forest. Mm-hmm. But there was a plan in mind when the university was built originally to try to keep the density on this side, the human population on this side, and the other half of campus, if you draw it diagonal, more or less, across, right, to be green area. So basically half the upper northwest corner would be green, and the lower southeast triangle would be populated. Okay, so let's see if we can hold on to that plan, more or less. Mm-hmm. Okay, but our density is in this area of campus. All right, so this brings the question of the clustering of humans into what is known as megalopolies. So a megalopoly is a city, a metropolitan area that has more than 10 million people living in that city in high density, okay? 10 million people living in one city. What do we have in Miami-Dade County? About 2 million, 2 to 3 million. Just for comparison. $2.7, okay? Almost 3 million people. That's Miami-Dade County, the whole county. City of Miami, well, anyway, let's assume that the county is populated, but we're nowhere near a megalopoly yet. Okay? But these cities have been growing over time, and there are currently about 45 megalopolis throughout the world. Cities that have at least 10 million people or more, all right? Some up to 20 million. These are some of the biggest ones. Tokyo, Yokohama, which has now become, it's so high density that you can't really tell one city from the other as moving through. A little bit like what happens when you go on I-95 here locally between Dade and Broward. You cannot really tell where Dade ends and Broward County begins. And even if you go into Palm Beach, because the Tri-County at the eastern shoreline there is one huge area, but it's still not a megalopoly. But anyway, that's the concept. When cities start merging into each other, then they start increasing in population density. Like, for example, when Hialeah started, you go back 40, 50 years ago, there was grassland, there were farms in between the city of Miami and Hialeah. Hialeah was out north. There was open country in between Miami and Hialeah. Today is one huge city, right? Okay, so Tokyo, Yokohama is one. New York, of course, here's Manhattan. What is this? What is this called? East End or something? The east tip into the Hudson River, Hudson Bay. Mumbai in India used to be Bombay. Beijing used to be Peking, right? These are megalopolis. On that spreadsheet, I also have here the list of megalopolis. So here's the 45. It says 46 simply because the first row is labels, all right? 10 million going up, 11, 13, 14, 17, 19, 20 million, 21, 25, 30, 37 million. The biggest, the most dense city in the world, Tokyo, Yokohama, almost 38 million people, all right? So the first 10, 9 of them are in Asia. And then there's New York City. So that's why when we look at that map, let's see if we can do this. There. This little map here. Okay, the first 10. Are in Asia. There we go. Except for New York City. So that's this and this. Sorry, Asia, not India. So first 10 are all in here except for New York City, okay? Then and they're all above 20 million people, the first 10, above 20 million. So it's double the number of a megalopoly. Then the next 5 make up the ones that are 20 million or above, all right? They're spread around. We have 2 more in North America, 1 in North America, actually almost 1 in every continent. 1 in North America, which is going to be Mexico City. Then Sao Paulo in South America. Lagos, which is the capital of Nigeria. So 2 in Africa, Lagos and Cairo in Egypt. And then Mumbai in India, right? So the next 5 of the 45, so that are spread around different continents. Bottom line, The first 15 are over 20 million people. Then, of course, they start spreading around through other parts of the world. I think the first European megalopoly is Moscow. Yeah. And the second one is Istanbul. Well, this is debatable. I know that Turkey has been trying to come into the EU, but technically it's still in Asia, so this should be Asia. I don't know why it's listed as Europe. Anyway, let's get to the bottom line of all this. When we come down to adding the total number of people who live in the 45 megalopolis, right? In other words, the 45 cities of the world that have over 10 million people. Only 45 cities out of thousands and thousands of cities in the world, okay? So when we add all those people, we come up to this number here. When we add all of the square kilometers of these cities, we get this number. And when we do the math of that, we come up that 11% of all the people of the world, 11% of all the people of the world live in these 45 megalopolis, right? So this is the total number of people in the world. And so the percentage between these two numbers is 11%. This is saying that more than 10% of all the human population lives in 45 cities, in only 45 cities, which are the megalopolis. When we look at the surface area, this is the total surface of all of those 45 megalopolis. This is the total surface of the land mass that is available, that is livable. So when we do that percentage, we come up with a 0.8%, less than 1%. So the take-home message is this. More than 10% of the people of the world live in less than 1% of the surface of the earth. It's just amazing. So what's the take-home message? Do we have an overpopulated earth? Not at all. When we fly, when we used to fly, all right, and we look out the airplane window, on the ground, we see mostly vegetation. We see mostly green, or we see mountain ranges, or we see agricultural land, or we see just forests or grassland, looking out an airplane window. And every now and then we go up on top of a city or a megalopoly. Then, of course, we see buildings, all right? But most of the surface of the earth, is not populated, all right? And in fact, more than 10% of all the people of the world only live in 1% of the entire surface of the earth. So what we have is definitely overpopulated megalopolis. We have overpopulated cities, but we don't have an overpopulated world as a whole. You follow? And that's why it is definitely not a homogeneous distribution. It is not a homogeneous distribution. It is very much heterogeneous. It's very much clustered. And that is typical of all species, but of the human in particular. I mean, we cluster in steroids, as they say, okay? So if other species tend to cluster more or less to form a population, to arrive at that carrying capacity of a particular region, of a particular ecosystem, we tend to overcluster. We tend to overpopulate into cities. And the general trend in the world is to move from the rural area into the urban area, from rural into urban, no matter where we are in the world, okay? So for example, we can do something like this, world at night. When we look at these images, well, this is the US. You see that most of the world at night, most of the landmass is dark, all right? And you have the contour of the cities, of the megalopolis. These are actually satellite images. So most of the world is really not overpopulated, okay? It is these high density areas. And the challenge here is that people like to move from the rural area into the urban area, from rural into urban. So what happens? Of course, generally in the rural area is a tougher way of life in general. Of course, I'm stating generalities here because you have to work the land, typically get up early, and it's a hard day's work. There may not be as much internet. I'm talking about the world as a whole, not just the industrialized nations, but there may not be enough internet, enough electricity, enough drinking water, etc. So in general, there's this movement from the rural area into urban areas, okay? The unfortunate thing is that many of the people who are moving into urban areas, they don't bring with them any particular skills to survive in the urban area, okay? To survive in the city. And so they end up increasing the poverty level of that city because they don't have any particular skills to survive, let alone to thrive in the city. Of course, what is needed is education, at least basic education. But if people move away from the rural area, then what happens is that the farmlands are abandoned, okay? And there's not enough hands to work the land, literally. They come into the urban area, but they don't have any particular skills to survive in the urban area. So they live in misery and they become part of the population that is dependent on the infrastructure, and it taxes the infrastructure of that city. And this is, in my opinion, the big challenge, is to try to keep people in the rural area. So to better the conditions of rural areas so that people don't feel that need to move into urban areas. Okay? Because again, when we consider these areas of large population, these megalopolis, then what happens? There's more crime, there's more violence, there's more challenging situations, difficult living, because what we're seeing as a human species is that when our density gets too high in a particular geographical region, we don't do well as a species. We just become too aggressive, too competitive. And all kinds of vices start setting in. Generally, again, this is generalization, but generally life is healthier in the rural areas. There's not as much crime, violence, and so forth. See? And so there's something about our species, again, looking at us biologically, that when we become too dense, we don't do well. We just become too competitive and all kinds of crime and vice sets in. See? And therefore, it's a constant effort to try to decentralize these urban areas, especially the megalopolis. However, the trend is going in the opposite direction. The trend is going toward forming more and more megalopolis because people just keep pouring in. We see it even in South Florida in our local region. This is one of the areas of largest growth in the whole United States, the Tri-County, Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. I've seen it because I've been here for about half a century, since 1970, over half a century now. And I have seen the East Coast, the southeast coast of Florida, just continue to rise in density. The kind of the latest development in the county is, of course, Brickell, which is becoming a mini Manhattan. They want to make a mini Manhattan out of Brickell, just a few blocks south of downtown there, between downtown and the Rickenbacker Causeway. But it's becoming very, very high density urban living. And time will tell, all right? But that will bring its own problems, beginning with the infrastructure of drinking water, transit, etc. Okay, it's 11 o'clock now, so let me stop for a moment, take a little break. I need a break. Probably you need a break. I'm going for a couple hours, an hour and a half. So anyone has any question or comment? Okay, you've been following along. Let's take a break to try to digest a little bit of this, and we'll come back to the second half, probably not go as long. Okay. So I'm gonna stop the recording, come back in about at 11:15, all right? Take 15 minutes. Be back at 11:15. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Sorry for the delay. Just freezing in here again, so I had to go get more layers. Okay, so we had left off with the issue of overpopulation, the question of, is the world overpopulated by humans? And the straight answer to that is that no, it is not overpopulated as a whole, right? First of all, we really don't know what is the carrying capacity of the human population to begin with, but even beyond that, just by looking at the numbers, surface area and population density and so forth, the world as a whole is certainly not overpopulated, but these megalopolis and these large density areas are presenting a big challenge, big urban challenges today, all right? Most of the population of the world is concentrated in these few cities. And there is that general flight from the rural area into urbanicity. And that again is a big challenge because fewer and fewer people really want to work the land, and they come into cities unskilled, taxes, the infrastructure, in many different ways. Now, we want to look at, we're going to look a little bit at the United Nations Development Goals. And the background to this goes back to the 1990s, to the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, okay? So UN Development Goals. To look a little bit at the background. First, goes back to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the beginning of the 1990s. At that time, 178 nations, or close to 200 nations in the world today, depending a little bit how you classify them. So the vast majority of the nations of the world participating in the United Nations came up with this Agenda 21, all right? In other words, that was a big watershed, if you will, of the Rio Earth Summit, dedicated to looking at the human population and our impact on the world on many different aspects, but basically to see overall how we can maintain a sustainable population and how we can sustain the population of the world on Earth today. Then that, of course, developed in the year 2000 into the Millennium Summit. So these are meetings that do go on a yearly basis in different parts of the world, sponsored by the United Nations. But another key moment was the Millennium Summit for the year 2000. And that was at the UN headquarters, which is in New York City, by the way. Okay. I don't know if you've ever seen that building. There are two buildings there, two main buildings. UN New York. Yeah. Okay, it's right on the Hudson, on the East River, I guess. These are the UN buildings in New York City. All the flags of the world and so forth. Pope Francis was there, I guess, 2 years ago. I think it was, I forget if it was 2019 or 2018. I think it was 2019 when he came to visit the US. Here they have the development goals projected on the side of the building at night. That's the General Assembly Hall. Okay. So, oh, sorry. So in the Millennium Summit in the year 2000, 8 goals were developed to be achieved by 2015, all right? Very ambitious. 8 goals were established to be achieved by 2015. And these are the 8 goals here. First of all, eradicate hunger. Also achieve universal primary education. In other words, so all people in the world have primary education, elementary, essentially. Gender equality, and to try to get rid of the overall abuse of women throughout the world. Reduce child mortality, improve maternal health. These are all put on the positive note, okay? At that time, combat HIV was still a big epidemic in different parts of the world. Malaria, which has been going on for decades, if not centuries. Universal environmental sustainability. It's a pretty broad, right? Environmental sustainability, imagine that one. That would be all basically green, getting away from fossil fuels and so forth. Extremely ambitious. And partnership for development, another one that's pretty fuzzy. But partnership for development was essentially that poor countries and rich countries will get together so that they can help each other out. Mostly the rich countries supplying the technology and the infrastructure and so forth for the poor countries to be able to develop and come into a developed world, all right? Now, just to have an idea of these 8 goals, which are extremely ambitious, that were supposed to be achieved in 15 years. These were established at the UN Millennium Summit in the year 2000. Just want to see what the population was in 2015. Probably around 7 billion, 7.2 billion. Okay, 7 billion. So we have, in 5 years, we have grown 1 more billion. Almost, not quite, because it's 7.2 to 7.8, right? Anyway, that was the goal. The development goals is 8 development goals to be met by 2015, all right? Extremely ambitious. There was a lot of synergy, if you will, in the turn of the millennium at the year 2000, because we were entering the 3rd millennium, which would be the millennium of the Enlightenment and so forth. And we had so much technology available and capital and wherewithal that these goals were thought to be achievable in 15 years. Okay, very laudable, but extremely ambitious. Needless to say, not one of these goals was achieved by 2015. Some were improved. I would say that overall, they were all improved a little bit, some more than others. One particular example, for example, now with the different cocktails that are done of medication and so forth, HIV/AIDS, at least in the United States that I know of, is kind of under control. People not necessarily dying, they're living longer lives, but that's just one example, all right, and one small subset of all the issues that needed to be tackled. So were not achieved by 2015. Therefore, what the United Nations did was double the goals, all right, to be achieved by 2030. So they pushed it out, they kicked the can essentially down 15 more years and double the goals, more than double the goals. All right, so now there are 17 goals for sustainable development to be achieved by 2030. So, sorry. And in a sense, they're a little more bold, all right? So no poverty. This is by 2030, we're in 21 now, okay, so 9 years from now. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean air and sanitation, renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, technology, reduced inequalities. I don't know how this one is distinct from gender equality, but it is. Anyway, there's a lot of ideology that's built into these goals, all right? And it's not necessarily a Judeo-Christian ideology, it's a secular, humanistic ideology that's built into these goals. Very sad, very utilitarian. Sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, recycling, climate action, life below water, the whole issue of the oceans, the rivers, waters, lakes, life on land. So some of these is hard to see how they're distinguishable. Life on land distinguishable from climate action, but they make a difference. They make a distinction. Peace and justice, well, that's certainly from the Gospels, right? Peace and justice, we've been shouting that out for centuries. And partnerships for the goals. Again, trying to link poor nations and rich nations and middle nations to cooperate with each other so that these can be achievable. Again, basically the first 8 goals were not achieved by 2015. So what the UN did is it doubled the goals, more than double them, and kicked them down 15 more years, which is now 9 years away. My personal opinion, highly unlikely. However, you know, as goals to be achieved fully, not really, okay? But If we see them as a work in progress, the work in progress, that's a different story, right? So work in progress, yes, and they are laudable in principle. Then when you start getting into it, we need to see if it's going to be from a utilitarian mentality. Frankly, we take exception to that in principled bioethics, and this program is taught as principled bioethics. So we would take exception to a utilitarian way of achieving these goals, which would be essentially whatever means it takes to get there, to get to the goal, to the end, would be justified. We take exception to that in principled bioethics. The means also have to be justified. And that's why it's actually taken longer to achieve these goals, because we just cannot manipulate people in a eugenic mentality to achieve these goals, because it's not fair, it's not human, it's not honest, it's not ethical, all right? So ultimately, it will fall back into principled ethics, which is at the core of the human person, the dignity and the sanctity of the human person, all right? Whether they like it or not, but utilitarian is trying to shortchange the pathway, and it's just not going to make it, frankly, because history has proven that whenever we manipulate people, it comes back to haunt us. Okay. So that's what we have. Anyway, if we see them as a work in progress, we can participate and try to partner. The Vatican, for example, has been a permanent observer to the UN for decades, and has a voice, but no vote, because not an official member, but is a permanent, it's known as a permanent observer, okay? And we know that Pope Francis is certainly very big on many of these, if not all of them, but from a different perspective, not from a utilitarian perspective, but from a principled perspective, all right? And we know that he's very, very proactive. In fact, the first encyclical dedicated to the environment, precisely in 2015, was written by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, which we have seen little bits and pieces of it. Actually, I should talk more about it. Next lecture, I'll be addressing more the encyclical of Laudato Si on care for our common home by Pope Francis, published precisely in 2015. And the two conferences that we've done here at St. Thomas University based on the encyclical, all right? But basically what we have is a desire to make the world a better place in which to live. But in doing that, we cannot run over people, we cannot impose ideologies that are not according to the deep sense of our human nature, that we are God's image. So whenever there is going to be manipulation, then it will come back to haunt us. The people sooner or later will not accept it. So a number of these goals that are that the UN is trying to implement, particularly in poor countries, in developing countries of the world, the people just simply rebel because they have a traditional understanding of family life and so forth, and therefore they don't accept that manipulation of massive contraceptives and so forth. Okay. Speaking of that, by the way, there was an article, you know, I keep saying not a week goes by without new some bioethical issue coming up. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was another article in the BBC and other news media, which are secular, humanistic news media, of how the fertility rate throughout the world is actually plunging, okay? This is from the BBC. And I send you the article so you can read it. But basically, it is detecting how the replacement level of that 1.7, the magical 1.7 number of children to maintain the population of the world is decreasing and is coming mostly in the developing countries, all right? The developing countries who are no longer having as many children to replace or to feed into the vitality of the nation, to run the economy and so forth. So more and more people are going into old age, meaning Social Security and welfare. And so they're drawing from the system, but there's not enough young people coming into the workforce to generate the taxes to put into the system, okay? And so these countries, these developed countries of the world, which are mostly Europe and North America, but other parts of the world too, are seeing big problems in this because these are long-term population movements, right? It's not something that can be fixed in a few days, a few months, or a few years. It's long-term. It's like those huge oil tankers that, or cargo ships that are in the ocean traveling, and they have an inertia with them because they're so large. And even if those large cargo ships were to stop the engines and put the propellers in reverse, it will take several miles for that cargo ship to come to a halt simply because of the huge inertia that is carrying with it, all right? So it's just a simple little crude analogy of population growth and population density and the population size, population distribution by age. And when those, when there's not enough people being born in a nation, all right, that population is aging, and that will cause huge problems, demographic problems and social problems for that population as it's aging, all right? And that economy, in extreme cases, could even collapse, which will then be a tailspin, and that will occur rather fast, okay? If not enough people come into the economy to work, then that economy could collapse and signal big social problems for that country. And therefore, it could be that first hint of the little curve here, as it's trying to reach out, is trying to flatten out into the stationary phase, all right? The important thing here is that, of course, this is the largest number that exists. This is the global number. But this particular graph doesn't really exist in any one country. Each country has a different graph. And even at the level of the country, you know, that's small enough, but even the almost 200 countries that we have in the world, it depends on what area of the country also. Because let's just take the United States as a whole, right? It depends if we're talking about the coast, the East Coast, which is the most populated, or the West Coast, second populated, or the Midwest and the center, basically three general geographical regions of population, right? They have very different dynamics to them in their economy, in their sociology, and therefore it really depends where we're talking at the local level, how is this graph looking for the nation and for the region, each region of the world. So we have to be careful here that the young people who don't want to have any children anymore because it's too much of a hassle to bother, right? Then they can bring about the collapse of that community simply because not enough young people are going to be coming into the workforce. We're talking a human generation is about 20 years. So they stop having babies now, and it will be 20 years where we'll see that gap going into what was supposed to be the workforce for that time. Okay. Okay, so these are concerns. These are problems that we have ahead. They're complex. They are interrelated, but there's no substitute for generosity. There's no substitute for sacrifice. And that is really ultimately what will make us flourish, right? If we clamp down and close in and become selfish and self-absorbed and self-centered, just with material well-being and not worry about making a contribution to the social well-being, then we can actually collapse the society where we're living, all right? And so we have to be very careful to develop the proper values, and this is going right into the ethics of it, of a life of generosity and honesty and sacrificial love to participate in the economy, the local economy, including having children. And this is specifically for what is known as the most developed or industrialized nations of the world, again, mostly Europe and North America. Okay, folks, so this is about all I have to say for now. Go back to the original scheme of the day, the roadmap, basically. We looked at succession, how succession happens, beginning with the pioneer species, ended up with a climax community, where there will be a dominant species of major trees, 1 or 2 species only, that will dominate, and the whole ecosystem develops around these species as long as the climate stays stable, all right? And we talk about climate, remember long-term, not weather. The weather will change seasonably and over the years, but we're talking about climate here, long-term. And we looked at population growth in general and human population growth, all the way through the perception or the question whether we have an overpopulated world or not as a whole, but the megalopolies are a big concern. And then also how to project this into the future. There are a number of models. The UN obviously has a lot of clout because the vast majority of the nations of the world are members of the UN. And therefore, these developmental goals that seem very, very ambitious, maybe we can see them as a work in progress, and we can participate in that. But as long as the intrinsic dignity and sanctity of each individual human being is respected and sustained, then we can have a conversation and we can work together. All right? Okay, that's it. It's almost noon. I'm going to stop here. Meet again. Also, next Saturday is the 3rd, right? July 3rd. Okay, let me stop the recording. Don't go away, but let me stop the recording. We just need to decide on the July 4th weekend what you want to do, if you want to meet or not. Let me stop the recording so that I can download it and begin the video.